Okay, so um, the this is just a quote from the ILO, which identifies what the main objective is of a national minimum wage, reducing poverty, um, and so on. So, in introducing this issue, the Deputy President said, what we need is a meaningful national minimum wage, which makes a real difference in the lives of workers. And this is an issue that we've repeated in the negotiations. I should say, I've been coordinating Labour's delegation in the negotiations on the national minimum wage for the last year. So I'll say something about those negotiations and the frustrations involved. And one of the issues is that some parties, shall I put it that way, want to introduce a national minimum wage which will make no difference to the current wage structure, which in our view would be a completely pointless exercise and defeat what we've been trying to do. So the main purpose is to create a decent minimum wage floor and to transform the apartheid labor structure as Debbie was talking, as Debbie was explaining earlier. And its primary goal has never been to create employment. This is not the goal anywhere in the world. By raising working people's incomes, a national minimum wage could complement other industrial and economic policies and stimulate demand in the economy. But a national minimum wage set at whatever level cannot create employment by itself. The ILO states that Convention number 131 requires that not only workers' needs, but those of their families should be taken into account in fixing minimum wages. We all know the reality that the majority of South African workers, particularly black and women workers, are trapped in poverty. The line that Arden was talking about, the working poor line of 4,125 Rand, 53% of full-time workers fall below that, and we've explained what that working poor line is about. Here's a snapshot of working poverty in the country. The fact that half of workers in 2014 earned below 3,033 Rand a month. 50% of women workers earned below 2,600. 50% of African workers below 2,800. And 50% in the formal non-agricultural sector below 4,333 Rand a month. There's some technical issues around these figures, which I won't go into now, but perhaps we can talk about in question time. And in the last figure, which is from the quarterly employment statistics, quarterly employment survey, which economists have problems with for various reasons, indicated that the average wage for all workers in the formal non-agricultural sector is 14,731. It just gives you an indication of the broad gap between where most workers are and where high-paid workers are. Do workers receiving the sectoral determination minima escape poverty? This graph shows that the green line shows that those are workers achieving only their food needs. So some of the sectoral determinations fall below the food needs of workers, and the red line is the upper bound poverty line of Stats SA, and none of the sectoral determinations achieve that level. This is a graph, a table of sectoral determination minimum wages, but I won't go into it. You can look at it in your own time. So it's an indisputed fact that the vast majority of workers fall below the poverty line. The poverty line, which has been rebased or recalculated by a Stats SA, by Saldry at UCT, based on the Stats SA upper bound poverty line, is 1,319 per person, or 5,276 for a household of four. Why do we talk about a household of four? The reason is because for low-paid workers, the average number of dependents is 3, and actually many people believe that the number of dependents is more than that. The minimum living level needs to be treated with circumspection, as Mike Rogan said yesterday. It is not really a decent living level. It's a poverty line. It only provides for the absolute basic amount required for working families to meet their bare necessities to live from day to day. Bodies such as Saldry, Paxson, Peter Maritzburg, and Stats SA calculate minimum living level amounts based on a detailed analysis and costing of basic goods and necessities. But I've attached a table by Paxa from Pietermaritzburg, which is very interesting because what it shows is that even workers at, for example, a level of the working poor line of 4125 have a deficit at the end of each month because they cannot meet the basic necessities. And their table even excludes certain basic requirements such as education and other things. So these are some of the different poverty lines. That relates to what I was just saying, is that this deficit that workers experience from anything at or below 4,660 a month, which is higher than the working poor line, is something that you can look at. But what it really reflects is the fact that most working families are going heavily into debt. And the stress that we're seeing amongst poor working families is related to this precise issue. Are wages of South African workers high? A lot of South Africans, particularly middle class South Africans, believe that it's a given that wages are high when compared internationally. But this is a quote from the United Nations Development Programme, which quotes various studies which says that professional and managerial skills in the South African economy are highly paid, basically, that the median monthly wage for a manager in South Africa is more than double that of Poland and 3 times that in Brazil. A benchmarking study comparing South Africa and Thai automotive sectors found the ratio of artisan wages to be an incredible 12-1, reflecting the premium paid for skilled work. This is, of course, a legacy of our apartheid era. In sum, according to the World Bank, high wages in South Africa appear to be mainly due to high wages for managers and professionals and not to high wages at the bottom of the income distribution. This is the World Bank. Is this situation getting better or is it getting worse? This table shows a very alarming figure from Stats South Africa, the 2014 Labour Market Dynamics Survey. And the highlights in yellow there are the bottom 5% and the top 5% of the wage structure. And what the first row, or the third row actually shows, is that in 2010, the difference was round about 30 times between the top 5% and the bottom 5%. By 2014, in the space of 4 or 5 years, this had increased to almost 50 times. So the problem that Debbie was talking about is getting worse, not better. So the national minimum wage, we've argued, needs to be combined with a restructured collective bargaining system as part of a South African wage solidarity model. And one of the countries that was mentioned yesterday, which actually had an official wage strategy called the wage solidarity model, was Sweden, which required that those at the bottom of the wage structure received wages which escalated faster than those at the top. And this should be designed to progressively increase real minimum wages, reduce gaps in overall wage levels, and improve pay for all those in the bottom half of the wage structure. And the national minimum wage has been shown to be very important in Latin America, as Roxana spoke about, even in the UK and a number of other countries, in reducing wage dispersion, particularly at the bottom half of the wage structure. So we're saying to reduce wage inequality and working poverty requires not just a meaningful national minimum wage, which is an important element, but comprehensive collective bargaining in all sectors of the economy. And I'm going to speak a bit about the relationship between collective bargaining and the national minimum wage, but also social protection, which covers the 8 million unemployed who currently fall through the cracks of social protection, don't receive an old age pension, don't receive a child support grant. And one of the big controversies around this clash with the Treasury over retirement funds is that the retirement fund reform was supposed to be part of a comprehensive overhaul of the social protection system. And part of that was social development had proposed a grant, particularly for young unemployed adults. So Treasury has driven ahead with the one element and dropped the other elements of the comprehensive social protection reform. That needs to be dealt with. So a national minimum wage package would link the national minimum wage to an overall wage policy to address wage inequality. What does Labour propose? And I think it's important to mention here, Chair, that it's not just Labour that's here, but also community, and that Labour and community in NEDLAC has been working very closely together. And therefore, what we have proposed has been joint proposals by the Labour and community constituencies, all the three federations plus the community organisations. And our approach is that we are proposing a medium-term strategy, not a one-off big bang, but rather we pitch the national minimum wage between a minimalist and a maximalist position. The minimalist position pegs the national minimum wage to the bottom of the wage structure, and therefore, as we said, if you peg it, like business is trying to do, at the bottom of the current sectoral determinations, then it has no impact whatsoever on the current wage structure. If, on the other hand, you peg it at quite a high level, say 6,000 to 7,000 rand, which a lot of workers, by the way, legitimately expect the national minimum wage to be set at because it reflects their real pressures and their real conditions. The problem is that it would require too drastic a jump to be made over a very short time period. So the question is, how do we put in place a medium-term strategy which allows us to progressively transform the wage structure over time? And this is what we've been arguing in NEDLAC. A further part of our proposal, can you pass me a further part of the proposal, thank you, to have this progressive realization, if you like, of a decent national minimum wage, is the proposal that we came up with to have farm workers and domestic workers incorporated at a certain, in a certain tier of the national minimum wage, not to exclude them as is done in a lot of countries, but rather to incorporate them at between 70% and 80%, depending on the level at which it's set. What you'll see is the actual figures that we're proposing for the national minimum wage. Incorporation of domestic and farm workers at that tier would vastly improve their current positions as reflected in the current sectoral determinations. And I can go into that more in question time if you like. We haven't proposed a specific figure. We've proposed a range because we felt like there needed to be an engagement based on certain reference points or what we call indexing mechanisms, which I'll come back to in more detail later. But in relation to the current labour market structure that a lot of people were asking yesterday, how we move from where we are to where we want to be, there has to be a strategy and a range which really breaks with the excessively low minima which are currently dominant in the labour market. So what did the ANC's manifesto actually propose? A lot of people are familiar with the national minimum wage proposal. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that there are other legs of that manifesto, including the promotion of collective bargaining in all sectors of the economy and using bargaining councils to promote greater wage equity, including through using state incentives. Thirdly, requiring employers to report progress on measures to reduce extreme income differentials, which means tightening up Section 27 of the Employment Equity Act. And fourthly, strict regulation to combat atypical employment practices. But what we're saying is that without real mobilization by the labour movement, civil society, and progressive intellectuals, there's no hope of realizing this package, and that in fact, we have no hope even of achieving a meaningful national minimum wage at this point in the game. One of the things that has come up a lot from the floor, and Gillard asked me to speak about a bit, is the relationship between the national minimum wage and collective bargaining. I think it's very important that we understand that the national minimum wage has never been proposed in any way to substitute for collective bargaining or as a substitute for a campaign for a living wage. The vision has always been the national minimum wage sets a basic floor which acts as a springboard for a much stronger collective bargaining system. And ultimately, you do away with the need for a national minimum wage because you have far better wages determined at other levels. Someone spoke about the Swedish case. The Swedish case is interesting because they've got comprehensive, virtually 100% collective bargaining coverage in Sweden. And the unions there don't want the state to intervene because they feel they're strong enough. In Germany, they had the same approach. But what they found was with casualization, contracting out atypical work, 20% of the German workforce were classified as vulnerable and atypical workers. And therefore, a national minimum wage was introduced, initially resisted by the trade union movement, but actually championed by a union that the German speaker here is from, namely Verdi in Germany, the service sector union. So it's a complementary role. The minimum wage sets a floor and assists in compressing the wage structure. Collective bargaining improves it in various sectors. But also, remember, the national minimum wage doesn't deal with a range of other conditions relating to health and safety, pension and provident funds, industrial policy in the various sectors, etc. And that's the job of collective bargaining. So this is the approach which the ILO supports. They prefer a unified national minimum wage as against sectoral wages, and they support an approach which reinforces a collective bargaining system. So the point that we say here is really to emphasize the issue that statutory minimum wages cannot address the needs of the different layers of the workforce by itself, but collective bargaining cannot deal by itself with the problems of the most vulnerable and low-paid work. So the proposal is to have one national minimum wage complementing a system of comprehensive centralized bargaining. We would prefer it to be compulsory in all sectors of the economy. If not, there should be a systematic a strategy to promote comprehensive collective bargaining in all sectors. Debbie spoke about Americana. One of the biggest problems of Americana was the fact that you didn't have a recognized centralized bargaining structure, and employers tried to use that to create divisions amongst workers and so on. I won't go into that further now. So the challenge is to ensure sufficient union representativity in the most vulnerable sectors to allow for effective collective bargaining. Just an interesting case study is if you look at, I don't have a pointer, but if you look at the shortest part of the bar chart, of the bar graph, what the red shows is that after the introduction of much higher minimum wages, participation of low-paid workers, the lowest paid workers who are only earning one minimum wage, increased substantially in trade unions. So the idea that workers will not be interested in trade unions because the national minimum wage has been introduced or increased is not borne out by the facts. Again, the next one shows the same thing for workers earning 1 to 3 minimum wages in Brazil. What this chart is also very interesting because what it shows is if you look at about the fourth graph from the fourth bar from the left, that's in 2003, before the policy of rapidly increasing the national minimum wage was introduced in Brazil. And what the green part of the bar shows is all the agreements, the collective bargaining agreements that were below the level of inflation. So it was 58% of the collective bargaining agreements were below the level of inflation. By the time of 2012, when the national minimum wage had gone up by over 100%, the number of collective bargaining agreements below the level of inflation was only 4%. So this rippled up the wage structure and strengthened the position of all workers in the lowest half of the wage structure. In part, this is attributed to the fact that many wages in Brazil are calculated as multiples of one minimum wage, but it's not simply put down to that factor. So measures to combat wage inequality, this is what Debbie was talking about, and I'd like to elaborate on a couple of points. The first is that if we're going to reduce the levels of wage inequality, you know, what is the most popular yardstick that people use? They say the ratio of the CEO to the lowest paid worker is 150 times, or whatever. That is important. But it's not the only thing. What we're arguing is that excessive inequalities exist at many different levels in the wage structure and between different sectors of the economy. So if you, for example, take a sweeper or a blue-collar worker in one sector, and you compare them to their pay to the pay in another sector, there are huge disparities. The Swedish Solidarity Alternative model that I spoke about earlier only allowed, I think it was something, a dispersion of about 45% between wages in similar strata, whereas the dispersion here is massively higher. So we need to reduce it at all levels of the wage structure. Of course, the difference between the top and the bottom is very important, and we've got a proposal, which I'll come to, which tries to address that particular issue. So we're calling for a comprehensive package to set targets for the reduction of wage inequality over time. And the measures that we're talking about are, firstly, legal measures and policy frameworks requiring agreed ratios to be achieved between different levels of the occupational wage structure, building on Section 27 of the Employment Equity Act. Section 27 of the Employment Equity Act requires reporting by employers on wage differentials, and then it sets in place a sort of voluntaristic process for these differentials to be reduced. Number one, it's never been implemented. Number two, it's never been given any teeth. So we're saying that needs to be tightened up. Secondly, developing a wage equity policy framework which would guide collective bargaining, a national framework which all collective bargaining institutions would adapt in order to deal with their specific conditions. So for example, COSATU, and I think some other federations have also said, simply to call for across the board wage percentage increases entrenches the wage differentials, because if the differentials are already there, if you only increase by a certain percentage, it means those at the top are getting that percentage, those at the bottom are getting that percentage, and the gap is rising. Measures to regulate executive pay, which is something that Debbie knows a lot more about than I do, and it would be good to have a further discussion about that. An issue that we've stressed in the NEDLAC negotiations, both in relation to the national minimum wage, but also in relation to this issue of wage equity, is the massive procurement that government does through all agencies of state, and their incentives need to be attached to a requirement, firstly, to adhere to the minimum wage and other labor standards, and secondly, to a commitment to reduce, to promote wage equity. The next area is to promote wage equity in retirement fund investment policies. If you look at the Public Investment Corporation, we had a former chair of the PIC here yesterday. I'm not sure if he's here today. If all the investments of the PIC and the GEPF and the private sector retirement funds were attached to a condition to a promotion of wage equity, we're talking about, you know, a large portion of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange would be impacted. Ensuring that the public sector is a model wage equity employer. They've made some important advances since 1994, but a lot more can be done. And then finally, adopting private sector codes to include a wage equity requirement. A very interesting experiment which I often refer to because it's the only company that we know about. I think the one that Debbie was talking about was maybe in the US. Was it here? Okay, well, it'd be great to get more information, but the most well-known example that we were aware of was the PPC experiment, which was, you remember Ketso Gordhan, who was the CEO of PPC. He took a large pay cut together with the top 60 executives to reduce the 1 to 120 ratio between his salary and those of the lowest paid. And in an interview, he said, I took R1 million cut, I barely noticed it. He was getting paid at 8 million. But he said to the bottom 1,000, who as a result got 10,000 Rand increases in their salary that year, it made a significant difference. That reduced within the space of a year the ratio from 120 to 1 to 40 to 1. Imagine if we generalize this model to the economy as a whole, both the private and the public sector, what a powerful impact that could make. So we're arguing that the wage equity policy should be treated as a second leg of the introduction of the national minimum wage, and that the authority for overseeing implementation of the minimum wage should also be responsible for overseeing this policy together with the Department of Labor and moving away from the current voluntarist approach and having a properly regulated system. The first step could be relating to what I said earlier, that Section 27 of the Employment Equity Act could be amended to require that the top 5% and bottom 5% of all earners in all companies and institutions should achieve a particular ratio. For example, to start off with 20 to 30 times. We're using the 5% because we believe that's much more effective than just using the CEO and the person at the bottom, because that can be done. But what happens to the 5% above that and the 5% below that? But that's an idea that we're putting into the pot. The elephant in the room, of course, is the level of the national minimum wage, and I want to speak a bit about that in the indexation which we're proposing. Of course, the test is what I've been saying, is that the level must meet the test of transforming the existing wage structure, increase the income of the largest feasible number of the current working poor. And we, in this regard, have spoken about two benchmarks which we think can help develop that level of the national minimum wage which begins to achieve those objectives. The one is the ratio of 40 to 50% of the national average wage, which has been identified by the ILO and OECD as the most common ratio internationally. And secondly is to index it to the minimum living level, which I'll come back to. So the OECD shows in this graph that South Africa is at the lowest, we're at the bottom there, just over 20% of the national average wage, whereas the OECD is between 40 and 50%. And Brazil, for example, is around 40% of the national average wage. So this just indicates what the ILO is saying about where the national minimum wage to average wage clusters in most countries. The average wage, of course, is the total number of people working in the economy divided, their total wages divided by their total number, as opposed to the median wage, which is 50% earned below and 50% earned above. So we've proposed that we use this range of 40 to 50% of the average wage, perhaps starting at a lower point in the range and gradually targeting an increasing proportion over time. One of the issues which you can come back to in question time is there's actually a controversy as to what the real level is of the average wage, what the real level is of wages in the economy in general, as well as the median wage. But that's something that we've been dealing with in a particular way. Oh dear. Okay. So